Many Christians struggle to discuss their faith with others. So today, we're going to give you our number one tip to help initiate spiritual conversations.
And because it sounds a bit crazy, we're going to jump straight on in.
Because our number one tip to help people find freedom in sharing the gospel is to remove the agenda of sharing the gospel for a while.
Now, you might ask, how does that make sense?
Well, let's consider the logic.
The reason spiritual conversations are difficult for some of us is because we're aware that we're trying to sell them something to someone who might not want to hear it. It's like we're trying to share our version of the truth with someone who thinks differently. So, how about this as a thought? What if our nerves are legitimate because we're picking up on something that's real?
You see, what might happen if we approach this differently? Instead of the starting goal being to tell them the gospel, we instead put that agenda aside for a while and ask some sincere questions as the starting point. You see, for me, I'm genuinely interested in spiritual things. And so when I started doing this, I still took an interest in people's spiritual beliefs using questions. But because the questions came with no agenda to have to tell them something, I wasn't nervous, so they weren't nervous, and it changed the dynamic of the conversation.
You see, if we ask open-ended questions, people open up. And if we're not pushing anything too much, they have no reason to be defensive. And because questions beg questions, it's surprising where a conversation like that can go.
For example, a hitchhiker replied to a question I once asked by saying, "I'm not really interested in religion." But because my goal wasn't to preach at them, I wasn't disappointed. So I asked what came naturally, which was, well, what are you interested in? To which they ironically felt safe enough to talk about religion, and we had a great conversation. In another similar conversation, when a guy said, "I'm not interested in religion," I once simply quipped back and said, "Why is that?" Because I was genuinely interested, and because he could tell I didn't have an agenda, we had a great conversation.
Which is to say, the freedom of the conversation has a lot to do with the dynamics of the conversation. If we want conversations to be open and real, we can't start with an agenda like a salesperson. Instead, we need to ask authentic questions and let the conversation take its natural path. Give us an example of this, Dave.
I was on a plane one day, and the guy sitting next to me and I introduced ourselves. And he discovered I was in Christian ministry and simply said, "I don't really want to talk about religion," which was fine with me, so we talked about other things. After a few minutes, he said, "Hey, what do Christians think about this?" To which I replied with a single sentence and turned the conversation back to what we were already talking about because he'd broken a rule of conversation. He changed the topic midway. So what do you think he did?
He ignored your question?
Exactly right. He asked a succession of sincere questions about the Christian faith for the remaining hour of the flight.
Now, let's look at what just happened. First, when Dave found a way to mention spiritual things early on, it made spiritual things a possible topic of the conversation.
But then when the man said he didn't want to talk about religion, I don't think he was saying he wasn't interested in religion.
Yeah, maybe he was actually just asking or saying he didn't want to be preached at.
And that was fine with me because I had no agenda to preach at him and I was happy to respect the boundary.
But then he asked Dave a spiritual question. Why?
I don't think it was actually about the question he asked. I think the unspoken question was more like,
"You seem reasonably normal to me. Can you talk about spiritual things without having to say everything at once and without always having to be right?"
To which my one sentence reply was intuition kicking in. It was a way of saying, "You can lead the conversation. I won't push anything." To which his unspoken reply was,
"Well, thanks, because actually I've got a lot of questions."
And I quickly had the impression he'd been waiting years to ask them.
You see, if we look at Jesus' conversations in the Bible, the approach he modeled was this. He asked questions with an ear open to the Spirit. There was no one formula or script.
And every conversation was different because every person was different.
Exactly. And that's really all we're saying. If you find spiritual conversations difficult, why not try putting your agendas aside for a while?
That's right. Try to understand what they believe. Ask sincere questions because questions beg questions. And with this approach, I've found that opportunities do open up.
Hey, we hope this helps.